This day is brought to you by Progressive. Are you driving your car or doing laundry right now? Podcasts go best when they're bundled with another activity, kind of like Progressive home and auto policies. They're best when bundled too. Having those two policies together makes insurance easier and could help you save. Customers who save by switching their home and car insurance to Progressive save nearly $800 on average. Quote a home and car bundle today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $793 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. Today we are kicking off a multi-part series that we are calling Hangers-on Week. Historically, it's that part of the election calendar, late February into early March, where the presidential primaries are rolling along. There might be one or two or three candidates in the mix who have a shot, but then there's also this whole group of other candidates just hanging on. They probably don't really have a shot at the nomination, but for one reason or another, they are still out there on the trail, running ads, doing their thing. So we wanted to spend some time with the Kuciniches and the Kasichs and the Allen Keys of the world. So welcome everyone to Hangers On Week. And what better guest for this than Amy Walter, who is going to join us for the first two episodes of this series. Amy is the editor and publisher of the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter. Has been on the show before, but thank you so much for doing this. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you, Jody. Although being on the hangers-on, it almost seems as if maybe you're saying something about me, right?
No.
There's no one better to talk to about staying around too long than Amy Walter.
The reason we thought of you, to be perfectly honest, is there was probably no one better to play the game of, hey, you remember that guy? Than you.
That's fair.
So,
that's fair. I've been around long enough to know all of those guys. Yeah.
And here, as always, of course, Nicole Hemmer Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So a little more framing of the series and then we'll dive in. But the plan for the series is in this episode, we're going to do a bit of like a taxonomy of the hangers-ons, a tour and an overview to help understand who these folks are, why they stick around, name check some folks. Then in the subsequent episodes, we're going to focus in on a few candidates through history who we think are particularly interesting and tell us a little something about why people do hang on. Amy, first off, though, I mentioned sort of where we are in the calendar. I know that this year is very different from past years where they're basically locked in. We don't have to get into that. But in general, in an election cycle, this late February, early March, just before Super Tuesday window, can you kind of place us in terms of what the fields for an open nomination kind of tend to look like?
Yeah, that's a really good point because, Iowa, New Hampshire, and in some different years, maybe South Carolina has already gone right before we get into the big Super Tuesday in March. And it has culled the field, certainly. And the ones who are still sitting in the mix, the ones who are still competing, are those who either have a somewhat viable path, right? They can make the case for how they can win the nomination, or they have something to prove. And that is either that they want to maybe make it to their home state, right? And show that people here really do like me and I can, I need to have a good showing there. Or there are certain types of voters who really believe in me and I want to let them have their opportunity to cast a ballot for me. But yes, I'm going back and thinking to our most recent open primary, which of course was 2020. And, going into South Carolina, boy, it was a real mess. Mm-hmm. And I don't think anybody could have told you that it was clear that the field was eventually not only was going to be culled down to Joe Biden, but that everybody else would agree that, you know what, it's time to lay down arms and all hold hands and unite around Biden. I also go back to the 2008 primary and I think about the night of New Hampshire And going into that primary, I was the editor of the hotline at that time. And I remember telling my staff, oh, don't worry, it's going to be an early night. Look, all the polls have Obama up. And, everybody was writing the sort of pre-bituaries for, Hillary tried, but too bad, the race is over. And after New Hampshire, it's all but in the bag for Obama. And then, of course, the upset in New Hampshire, and the race went on and on and on because it was a real race. And it was up until those last waning days of the campaign when there was the fight over superdelegates and the role that they would play. This thing was a real contest. And now you're right. It's not only that it's been a very non-competitive race, but just how quickly and easily a candidate named Donald Trump, who not that long ago, I looked back in April of this past year, less than half of Republicans picked him as their number one choice. And now he's at 79%. Mm-hmm. So this happened much more quickly than I think it looked to be earlier this year.
Yeah. So you started to lay out, well, first off, I think laid out, and we should get back to this, kind of those little threads of remember in this year, it all turned on a dime, which I think a lot of these hangers-ons hang on to as their thread of hope.
Good point.
Right? But you also started to lay out, and this is what I think we want to do in this episode, and you sort of did this brilliantly in an email back to us when we reached out to you about this. You started to lay out the kind of basic incentives that you can start to categorize people into in terms of why they stick around beyond just that thread of hope. So obviously there's, the primary candidates who go on to win the nomination. There's ones who really feel like they have a shot. But, one that you've pointed out to us, and maybe this is a good place to start, is kind of people who genuinely feel like they can influence the party by sticking around. And we can name some of the names, but you pointed out, the most obvious, Elizabeth Warren in 2020. But can you just sort of describe a little bit of that type of candidate who just is really in it to... It's sort of a cliche, but it's also true for some people. I want to influence the direction of the party.
That's right. I think you can look at somebody, I'll go back to, say, Pat Buchanan, mm-hmm. right? We can go back all the way back to 1992. Now, he was challenging an incumbent. This wasn't an open seat. This is George H.W. Bush. And Pat Buchanan, you can look at that campaign, listen to his rhetoric, read the descriptions of his agenda at that time, and you... can hear the Donald Trump of the 1990s, right? Like you can see where the infrastructure for what would become known as Trumpism, MAGAism, however we want to call it, was really begun. And so even though, look, Pat Buchanan didn't, I don't think he got any delegates. He definitely altered the way in which the party should have been thinking about this conservative element, which at the time we really saw as being more culturally conservative. I don't think we appreciated how much he was laying the groundwork for more of a sort of economic populism and nationalism that then was picked up in the 2000s by a Mike Huckabee and a Rick Santorum.
Yeah, and I think, for what it's worth, I think our next episode will try and kind of dive a little deeper into them too. So they'll get their due.
Well, and on the Pat Buchanan front, and then I will transition to someone else since we're coming back to Buchanan. But Buchanan wasn't going to be a hanger-on. He had, in New Hampshire, his concession speech written, and then he ended up coming in second in a much closer way than he expected. He expected to lose by 40 or 50 points. Honestly, it was only like 17.
I think it was 10 or was it like that?
It was double digits. It was a significant gap, but it was much closer. And so he gets rid of his concession speech and he decides to stay in, not to win, but to shape the direction of the party, to put out his vision and to try to push Bush to the right. And I think that Bernie Sanders, actually in 2016 and a little bit in 2020, plays that same role. I mean, in 2016, I think that he felt that there was some stuff he could do at the convention to potentially become the nominee, but also I think was holding out a different vision for what the Democratic Party platform could look like and what it could emphasize in ways that I think it has actually changed since 2016 and 2020. And so you can see in both Buchanan and Sanders the effectiveness of being a hanger-on, because you really can push the party in a particular direction and show that there is real support for your vision going into the convention.
Yeah, I saw some of that too with Elizabeth Warren, I felt like, because I believe it was 2020. It was like it took her longer to sort of step out of the race. And I think part of it too goes back to what you were saying, Amy, when you have people that are like, we're rooting for you, we're, you know, like, and you don't want to let them down, or you want to sort of hold on because you feel like there is support, albeit not majority, but there is significant support that's hard to sort of like turn your back to in some ways, that I think Elizabeth Warren still has those, I don't know, maybe I'm biased because I'm from Massachusetts, but still has some of those feel-good feelings, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's such a good point too, Kellie, because, you know, we sort of forget as we cover these and as we talk about them, especially historical, in a historical way, that these are humans. And I say that to people all the time about why I really love covering politics is that, yeah, we can go deep into the data and we can build models and do voting analysis. But at the end of the day, it really does hinge on the human beings that have to vote, right? And the human mind is very complicated, and we're asking humans to take a lot of complicated information and basically narrow it down to one of two choices. But we're also asking human beings who, you know, have the gumption and have the, I think, the quite amazing ability to put themselves out in front of the world saying, I'm going to let you judge me. And I will, you know, rise or fall based on how you feel about me. There's an emotional component to this that I don't think we always appreciate. And the people that you surround yourself with as a candidate, right? Are they people who are saying, like Kellie was saying, you can do this. You need to stay in this fight. This is why you're doing this. Please don't drop out. All the little girls are looking to you, you're the first to try this. Please stay in. This is why you do these things. And then there's the ego and the hubris that goes with it as well.
So a couple other folks who I think fall into this category that we're discussing here of, you know, really trying to shape the direction of the party. Going back further, I mean, I think Eugene McCarthy in '68 is a classic, you know, really like responsible for opening a conversation about the state of the Vietnam War. And certainly, I think we may see this with Elizabeth Warren, certainly with Bernie Sanders. You know, often it's like the generation that's galvanized by the candidate who doesn't win is the one that then sort of like over time you start to realize, oh gosh, you know, they're the people who are really shaping the future of the party. I'm sure Buchanan falls into that as well. Can we move on to another quick category here, which I think is a pretty obvious one, but an interesting one, which is, you know, the people who are hanging around and angling in whatever way for the VP nomination. And so, you know, you have Kamala Harris in 2016, John Edwards in 2004, Joe Biden in 2008, I think all did that. And I guess my question, Amy, and then, you know, share any thoughts you have, but is if you are angling for a VP slot, it seems to be like there could be two tactics, right? Which is one, get out of the race and get on board with the person who you think is going to win and get in their inner circle as early as possible, or hang around as a competitor ostensibly, and then sort of transition later, maybe even at the conventions. So just from a strategic standpoint, kind of how do people make that calculus?
I think 2008 provides a really great example of this, right? This question you're raising, which is, remember, as we went down to those final days, there was a tremendous amount of pressure on Obama to say almost immediately, you know what, I'm going to pick Hillary Clinton as my running mate. She has been an incredible competitor. Look at how much we did to energize the electorate. You know, she was doing really well with some groups of voters. I wasn't. I was doing really well with some groups of voters. She wasn't. That's the coalition we need to put together to win this election. And he obviously went in a different direction. I don't know that it was necessarily because he thought, oh boy, well, she took me to the mat and I don't want to reward her for that. But it's certainly a very valid question to ask. And if you think about the ways that, say, Harris was criticized by many in the Biden circle for the way she attacked him in that first debate, right? Why are we rewarding her to be the vice president after she took you out, right? We want somebody who's going to be more loyal to you.
And it's a bit of a double-edged sword, right? Because if you stay in for a long time, if you hang on the one hand, you can say, well, I represent another coalition in the party. I have all of these folks who voted for me. It's kind of like Ronald Reagan and George Bush in 1980. We can kind of like come together. And if you, George, change some of your positions, then you would be an excellent running mate with me. But it can also be, and I think this is kind of the case for Clinton, you don't want it to seem like there are two presidents or that you're competing for the spotlight. And if you hang on too long, it can have a little bit of that feel, which I think can also shape the decision to choose someone else.
Do you ever feel like there's nothing new in the news? You know there are urgent things happening in the world around you, but all you hear is noise. That's why we made What Next? Our goal is to tell you the stories you haven't heard before, or maybe a different side to the story you thought you already knew all about. I'm Mary Harris, the host of What Next? And I love my job because it helps me cut through the noise of the news. And then I get to bring it to you. Together, we can figure out what next.
Hosted by Lindsey Graham, Wondery's podcast American History Tellers takes you to the events, times, and people that shaped America and Americans. In the latest series, American History Tellers explores the Underground Railroad, a covert network of secret routes and safe houses operated by men and women committed to helping enslaved people escape bondage in the South. Follow American History Tellers on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts.
But it's funny, vice president's not the only job up for grabs. Meaning, like, a lot of these candidates become cabinet members, you know. They get these high up jobs, or maybe they go another route and become, like, political pundits. But there's still some sort of job opportunity to be had, to say the least, for the party.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, I think that funnily enough makes me think of John Dickerson, who I think is such a smart kind of, he's always raising this conversation about, like, does the primary and the electoral process actually sort of test the credentials that then we want in a president? And to some extent, you know, I think, Niki, your point of, like, at least in the primary process, you know, the going through this, crafting a message, building a coalition, it does sort of show your mettle. It's not just, oh, this person's a big famous name, but actually, yeah, I've seen some stuff. I mean, the flip side, it's obvious, and I think actually is happening potentially to Nikki Haley now, who maybe was never going to be on Trump's list anyway, but like, the longer you stay in, and frankly, the more desperate you get, the more you have to sharpen your attacks on the other person, and the more you're accumulating opportunities to piss someone off, who then potentially would give you a job. And I mean, that is clearly what's going to happen, I think, to Haley and Trump, is that she's just going to start saying things that Trump is going to hold a grudge about, whether he was going to pick her or not. All right, let's move on, and I want to just, like, have an opportunity to name a whole bunch of folks. But, you know, unfortunately, one of our categories is sort of like, you're a bit of a punchline. And I mean, look, we've done a bunch of episodes on this show about people who are punchlines who don't deserve to be punchlines. I put Howard Dean kind of at the very top of that list. But yeah, I'm just going to read names and you folks just jive in on whoever you want. But, you know, Howard Dean, Lamar Alexander, Jeb, Wesley Clark, Herman Cain, multiple times, Rudy Giuliani, multiple times. You know, there's all of these folks who are like, oh yeah, remember that guy.
I love that you're both saying it with the exclamation point. Like, I can hear
and
it
Lamar.
as you say it.
Can we put, like, this is going to sound so bad, but, like, all the Kennedys? Or, like, Ted Kennedy for sure? Like,
Maybe, yeah. So,
I mean, definitely.
I mean, Amy, what do you make of any of those names I said, or what do you make of the fact that, like, inevitably, it feels like, you know, every election cycle, it's like you look in that initial stage and there's like 10 people on stage and you're like, 3 of you are going to be punchlines 10 years from now. We don't know which 3, but Rick Perry, it's probably going to be.
Right. We forgot to put Rick Perry in there, who really hasn't kind of survived that. And I, you know, Jeb Bush, beyond just becoming a punchline with the exclamation point, right? And he also became a stand-in for the death of the establishment, right? Yeah. That he represented more than just, it wasn't just, oh my gosh, he turned out to be a terrible candidate, but it was, oh, right, this brand of republicanism, there's no audience for it. And we keep seeing, and Nikki Haley, I think, is the latest incarnation of this, that wing of the party saying, no, we're not dead yet. And the share of that party continues to shrink. You're right. Dean, to me, fits into that category of not really fair that one night of losing his voice became just the culmination. But I do think also a harbinger for what we saw in this last election with, I'm not going to say it's exactly the same, but for Ron DeSantis, in this way. Ron DeSantis' theory of the case, or his super PAC's theory of the case, was that, we're going to come and win Iowa, and with that have momentum to go forward. And this is the most vulnerable place for Trump. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have this grassroots support that we're going to kind of import into the state and go and hire all these door knockers and build this incredible network on the ground, because that's what the caucuses really are, as well as using our money for air cover and really trying to undermine Trump that way. And it became pretty clear as we got closer and closer to the election that just having a bunch of people knocking on doors, especially those who weren't from Iowa, who weren't necessarily invested in Ron DeSantis, but were getting paid to do this, is not how you convince people to support your candidate. And I remember being in Iowa in 2004, and all of the people who worked for Howard Dean had these orange ski caps. And you would see these ski caps wandering around the streets of Des Moines, right? But what it also suggested to many people in Iowa was, oh, these are the outsiders, right? These are the kids who think they can come in to our state. Yeah, you're not from here. You're not really one of us. And so that idea that he did represent a national movement, which really turned into the Obama movement, right? Against the war, a younger generational candidate who could really galvanize a younger generation. But it wasn't done in a way that felt organic. And I think Obama, 4 years later, was able to become the organically anti-establishment, anti-war candidate.
When I think of like punchlines, I think more in terms of like cautionary tales. Like I think about Herman Cain and I'm like, oof, that's a cautionary tale.
That's an arc.
It is, but I feel like the last sort of things you see of Herman Cain are sort of like either denying COVID and then being in this like arena filled with people with no mask, and then like 2 weeks later he's like gone. Like that's nothing.
But also the moment when Herman Cain was like the guy, and like 90% of media coverage was about Herman Cain, and 999 was a sensation.
999. Again, cautionary tale.
And it's interesting though, because there's a difference between your Herman Cain characters who are sort of like almost spoof campaigns in a way. They become known for like a little gimmick, and they might have a moment, but there's no real viability to their campaign. But like with Jeb and Rudy Giuliani, they were front runners going into the election. And I think that there's something particularly pointed about someone who was heading into a coronation who ends up as a punchline that has a particular resonance to it that Herman Cain can't quite meet.
Yeah, that's such a great way to think about that, because, right, do you run for this to give your either idea or your theory of the case, or you just want to get some notoriety? I mean, I think Vivek Ramaswamy sort of fits in that category this year. Andrew Yang, to a certain extent, though he has taken his sort of outsider math vibe and turn that into, I'm going to be a third party, evangelist, but it's not getting the sort of traction that I think he was hoping it would.
Yeah. All right. I want to move on to a sort of final category, some final thoughts in this overview, but I just do think it's worth pointing out, a few like awards here. I mean, Alan Keyes and especially I think, Kellie, to your point, like someone who everyone understood was probably not going to get it from the beginning. Alan Keyes ran 3 times. Like William Jennings Bryan, I think, is the like classic, ran a bunch of times. There was a guy named Harold Stassen who had tried 9 times to be the nominee of the Republican Party. So we'll get into some of these folks. If you had asked me how many times has Dennis Kucinich run for a nomination, I would have said, like, I don't know, 6? I mean, it's only been 2, but for some reason he fits into this, like, he's always around, that guy again category.
He made an impression.
I suppose he made an impression. And again, to circle back to the kind of one of the first things you said, Amy, it's like, who else is on this? Hung around too long, too many times? Like Joe Biden, you could put on that list. And then lo and behold,
sure could.
he wins it. And so I think there's always that hope. So final category thought, kind of sum up here, is I really do think we have to acknowledge, and you can tell me whether it's cynical or not, but that a lot of these folks are in it for media exposure. And I do think there's also a very clear path towards you hang around too long, you get the more FaceTime, and then, hey, lo and behold, you're on CNN for the next 3-4 years. And so how much is that part of it?
If you don't succeed, try again.
Yeah.
That's the mantra. That's the mantra.
But I mean, how much is it like this will keep me in the conversation and maybe land me a spot in the political media ecosystem?
That is an excellent question. I don't know that in 2008, anybody looked at Mike Huckabee and said, you know what's going to happen? That dude is going to not only have a cable show, and now is he on Newsmax now, or one of those others? Yeah. I see him in commercials, all that sort of thing. And his daughter is going to be the governor of Arkansas, right? So some of this is, you catch lightning in a bottle. And maybe that's the way to think of it, Jody, is that, you're taking a big risk here. And at the end of it, you may be the punchline or utterly forgettable. The upside is things happen to you that you would have had no opportunity to, be invited to participate in, whether that is, again, getting the media exposure, whether that's being invited to be in the cabinet or have a senior role somewhere. But once you get in front of people, I'm trying to think about the way to think through this is more about like the upside seems to me is stronger than the downside, right? We live in an era where just getting exposure, where people say, I've seen you, is worth almost anything. And that we have, this is especially true now in an era where people are literally getting paid to be influencers who just show up and, hold a product in their TikTok or their YouTube channel for 5 minutes. So it's almost surprising, actually, that we don't have more people using this as a platform to be seen and then use it to monetize themselves, even for a short amount of time. But there we are.
Niki, any thoughts on that?
It probably speaks to the enormous amount of money and time that it takes to launch a presidential bid and actually get attention. But it is also the case that I think, especially since the 2000s, a little bit in the 1990s, running for president has become more monetizable because of a slew of cable networks that provide contributorship opportunities, talk radio to a certain extent, but then especially once you get into a monetizable social media era, that more people are going to try to use the presidential run to make money. And you never know how that's going to end up, because I think a lot of people in 2016 said, oh, Donald Trump is doing this to sell books and spike his Celebrity Apprentice ratings.
And get a TV show.
It went in a different direction.
Indeed it did. And now Mike Huckabee's the one with the TV show. So
good segue.
There we go.
Who would have thought?
And we are going to kind of focus in a little bit on that dynamic in the next episode with Amy, but I will say as we wrap up here, a couple things. One, I'm sure there are categories that we missed, and I'd be curious from listeners to hear about other categories. I mean, I'm even thinking, like sometimes this burnishes your credentials to then go run for another office, right? And so if you have other categories you want to slot people into, please let us know, listeners. And moreover, If there's names that we didn't mention, like I feel obligated to say the syllables Lyndon LaRouche. We haven't mentioned him, but
the like doors you've opened, Jody.
But other names, other categories, we would love to hear it from folks. But next episode, we are going to start to go into some of the names we talked about here, and we're going to talk specifically about this kind of Trumpian, pre-Trumpian universe of hangers-ons and how they then eventually did set a model for the politics we're living with right now. But we will leave it there. Thank you so much for helping kick this off, and thank you so much for coming back for one more episode. But editor and publisher of the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter, thank you so much.
Very welcome. So fun.
And Nicole Hammer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to This Day in Esoteric Political History. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Our transcripts, which you can find on our website, are done by Kala Nakua. This Day is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, creator-owned, listener-supported podcasts. Audrey Martovich is executive producer. Yuri Lasordo is director of operations. If you want to support the show, tell a friend about This Day and become a member of Radiotopia at whatever level works for you. You can do that at our website, thisdaypod.com. Also on our site, you can find transcripts, sign up for our newsletter, find links to follow us on Instagram and Threads, buy merch like shirts and hats and phone cases, find information about our theme song, give feedback on an episode we've done, or suggest topics for a future episode. That and lots more, thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avirgan. We'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.